Let me thank everyone for coming to today's Cold War Study Seminar. This is being held online in part to facilitate the recording of it. Today's seminar, my name is Mark Kramer. I'm the director of the Cold War Studies program here at Harvard. And the seminar today, I also happen to be giving this seminar. This is on archival research in the former USSR. And as I'll mention shortly, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Ukraine and Russia, and then the situation before and after February 2022. So with that, let me call up a PowerPoint presentation that will form the bulk of this presentation. Let me just see here. So this seminar has because even before February 2022 was an important one, but all the more so after the 24th of February 2022. So there are numerous. I've worked in all but the Turkmen and Tajik archives, which I haven't given a try at, but I have worked at archives in all of the other former Soviet republics. In this talk today, I'm going to be focusing only, though, on Russia and Ukraine, because they have been the ones that have been very directly affected. The archival, the status of our archives has been very directly affected by the war that Russia began in February of 2022. So let me start, though, just to say some words about Ukrainian archives. These are, I'll translate these. The Central State Archive of Public Organizations of Ukraine, that archive has been pretty much wide open since the 1990s. It holds the records of the former Ukrainian Communist Party, among others, but and very voluminous records, and have been fully accessible more or less since the 1990s. When I started working there in the mid-90s, it was already very open. Then there is the Central State Archive of the higher government organs to manage for the governance of Ukraine. That archive also has been open since the 1990s, has again another very useful archive since then. The branch state archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was open also in the 1990s, but has become much more open since 2000, or it had become much more open since 2014. There are also hundreds of regional and local archives for the party and state branches, and these two have been accessible for a long while. There is then also what is a big change, was that the branch state archive of the Security Service of Ukraine, this is the former KGB archive, the Ukrainian KGB archive, so it's predominantly counterintelligence. The foreign intelligence function is handled by a separate agency these days, and foreign intelligence was not really what the Ukrainian KGB did. It was primarily an internal security organization, although you will find some foreign intelligence, copies of foreign intelligence documents in this archive. This archive was not open in the 1990s. In fact, it really wasn't open except for a very brief period in 2009, but it really wasn't open until after the 2014 Maidan Revolution, and from 2015 on, the access at this archive and the working conditions were excellent. So you could order, the reading room was relatively small, but otherwise the working conditions were excellent, and archival employees were extremely helpful. The head of that archive, who is still working even now during the war, Andriy Kahut, has been extremely helpful and is also a very good director of the archive. Let me, though, focus a bit more on Russia, even though it is not, it's the Ukrainian archives. The major problem that they are having is that the country is coming under constant attack. That means that there is no guarantee that the physical safety of the archives can in any way be taken for granted. Russia is a different case. What is the situation in Russia is really much more driven by internal considerations. There were archives in Moscow that in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union disintegrated, there were some archives that were never made accessible to ordinary researchers. These included the Presidential Archive, which had basically it held the records of the Communist Party's Politburo, but also other important Lichnie Fondi, as they're known, the personal collections of the various Soviet leaders, and some other figures as well were in the Presidential Archive. The Central KGB Archive, which is now the Central Archive of the Federal Security Service, was also never made generally accessible. The Foreign Intelligence Archive, which is not, unlike the Central KGB Archive, which is in the Lubyanka, the Foreign Intelligence Archive is in a separate location in Yasenova on the southwestern outskirts of Moscow. It is completely inaccessible. And the Military Intelligence Archive, which is in central Moscow, but is inaccessible. None of these archives were ever made accessible, either under Yeltsin, certainly not under Putin. However, there is a long list of archives that are accessible. This is the list of the main federal archives that come under the Federal Archival Service. That archival service was established just after, or even before, the breakup of the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union disintegrated, the archival service took over full responsibility for all these archives. And it has been in charge of them ever since. The archival service has a website online that it also handles the separate websites of the various federal archives. That website is known as Archivi Rasi. The federal archives websites are all accessible, except for one that hasn't been accessible now for several weeks, which I will come back to and mention it. That's Rigani, or the Российский государственный архив новейшей истории, the Russian State Archive for Recent History. The website was functioning until sometime in, I believe it was early September, late August or early September, and then suddenly it stopped being accessible, at least outside Russia, for reasons that aren't clear, because all the other archives still are accessible. So in total, in the federal archives, there are about 70 Russian federal archives. There are about 70 million dela. It's actually more than that now. That was an estimate. That's the most recent estimate, but it's actually more than that. It's, in addition, there are about 150 million dela, that is files, in other state archives and non-state archives. There are important non-state archives, although these have come under pressure in recent years, especially with the disbanding of Memorial. But fortunately, Memorial's archive was digitized and therefore will continue to be accessible, even though the organization has been banned in Russia. The collections that I've referred to here amount to many billions of pages of documents. It's far more than even a team of researchers could go through in any reasonable amount of time. So there are bound to be collections still untapped. Even if they are accessible, they're untapped simply because the volume of material guarantees that there will be delays in looking through all of them, even now, 30 years after the Soviet, 30 odd years after the Soviet Union broke apart. There are fondi, that is departmental, thematic, and chronological, organized by department, by themes, chronological, and also Lichnia fondi, many of the archives. The Lichnia fondi, again, are the personal collections, and not personal in the sense of being strictly tied to the person, but it happens to be the documents that are amassed by that particular individual while in power. So these are the ones that I've worked in some of the oblast archives in Russia, but these are the ones that I have spent the greatest amount of time in. I mentioned Rigani, the Russian State Archive for Recent History. There is the Russian State in addition, the Russian State Archive for Social Political History. Those two archives split the former Communist Party archives. The second one, the Russian State Archive for Social Political History, covers the Lenin and Stalin years through October 1952, the 19th Party Congress. The Russian State Archive for Recent History covers the post-Stalin period, or the period from the after the 19th Party Congress. There's some, again, it's not a precise demarcation in that each archive has some materials that ostensibly would come within the jurisdiction of the other. But overall, it is quite a clear division that Rigani is the one, and that's the archive whose website is currently inaccessible. That Rigani is the one for the post-Stalin period primarily. It's Communist Party files. There is then a third archive, GARF, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, that contains many of the ministry files from the Soviet government. Not all, because there are some archives, there are some ministries that were allowed to establish separate archives. The Foreign Ministry Archive, for example, which I have listed here, the Foreign Policy Archive of the Russian Federation, that is separate and does not come under the jurisdiction of the Federal Archival Service, but it has been accessible, even though not always very easy to work in, since 1992. It is an archive in which persistence pays off, because otherwise you're not likely to get very much. And then also the Russian State Archive of the Economy, which is in the same building as GARF, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, but it holds separate files pertaining to the Soviet economy and also foreign trade and the like. So these are the ones that I have primarily worked in. They cover such things as high-level decision-making, that is increasingly Rigani, even though the Presidential Archive was not made accessible, the Presidential Archive is still in Staraya Ploshchad, where the Central Committee of the Communist Party had its headquarters. And Rigani was there for a while, but it was moved across the river about 5 or 6 years ago, and fortunately has received a great number of the Politburo files from the Presidential Archive and has made many of these accessible. So there is high-level decision-making on a wide range of matters. Foreign policy making, which is extensively documented in the various archives I referred to. All of the archives I've mentioned deal with internal politics and organizational questions, as well as foreign policy. The economic questions are covered in all the archives, but particularly the Russian State Archive of the Economy. And then social history and ethnic issues are very extensively, again, documented in the various archives, even if they are from the perspective of Soviet officials, and often have to be used with great caution, therefore. So neither Tsarist Russia nor the Soviet Union had any tradition of releasing archival materials to the public. During the Soviet period, access to secret post-war documents was limited to trusted employees of the Communist Party or the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the KGB. The overall archival collections in the Soviet Union were under the KGB or the NKVD's and then KGB's jurisdiction for many years, from the Stalin period until 1958, when there was a separate archival service established that oversaw archives that are now broadly within the Federal Archival Service's jurisdiction. The main responsibility of Soviet archival officials was to ensure that no items, no matter how inconsequential, fell into the hands of unauthorized researchers. That obsessive secrecy did not prevent the emergence of well-stocked and well-organized repositories. It is quite impressive, I will say, how well-organized a lot of the archives are, with extensive finding aids and quite accurate finding aids. The collapse of the Soviet Union came so suddenly that most archives were left largely intact. Soviet officials never expected that their top secret documents would one day be exposed to public scrutiny. So they tended to preserve most materials, and certainly not all, but most materials, even those in retrospect seem highly incriminating. There is a destruction, or at least weeding out of documents, and I will be glad to discuss that. I'm not going to get into it now, but later during the discussion period, I will be glad to come back to that. Copies were made of many documents so that they could be sent to one or two other repositories. So even when materials were destroyed or removed from one archive, there's a possibility that copies or at least closely related items will turn up elsewhere. A potentially more vexing problem comes from documents that never existed at all. That is, from decisions that were made without leaving an explicit paper trail of written orders, notes, or transcripts of deliberations. This was certainly done quite frequently, especially during the Stalin period, but throughout the Soviet period. Then the other key issue is documents that have not been released and may never be released. This pertains to whole sets of issues, but also to some particular events or particular decisions. So deliberations about key domestic and foreign policy decisions, both during and after the Stalin era, did not always get recorded in full. And again, sometimes they didn't really. There isn't really a paper trail to be found. In many cases, the paper trail gives only a fragmentary sense of what was discussed. So even if there is a paper trail, it may not really tell you what you really want to know. However, despite the obstacles caused by gaps in the written record and lack of useful memoirs, especially from the Stalin era, these don't necessarily hinder a better understanding of Soviet history. In a country that was as obsessed with record keeping of all sorts as the Soviet Union was, the documentation of most events and decisions was far more extensive than one would find elsewhere. Archives in the former Soviet Union are overflowing with documents that enrich our historical understanding. Even when genuine gaps in the record exist, one can always try to work around them. And that you do find now, I've listed several events in Soviet history here that are much better understood now, even if there remains a good deal of unknowable things, or at least unknown things about, particularly about the Kirov assassination, but also even about events that have now been studied in great detail. The famines in the early 1930s, the Great Purges, the Great Terror, all of these are events from the Stalin period. And some of these are it's not even so much that what is known about these is now very voluminous, but instead it's how scholars interpret them. And for example, on the question of the famine, the famine in Ukraine, the famine in Kazakhstan, the famine in southern Russia that occurred in the early 1930s, is how to categorize those or understand them. That's a separate issue that I'm not going to get into today. There's extensive literature on all of these topics. So let me offer some caveats, however. I've talked about some of the ways that archives can be useful. In the early 1990s, the then director of what was CHSD, it's now the archive known as Regani, that is the post-Stalin Communist Party archive, attested that, quote, far from all the documents that flowed into the Soviet Communist Party Central Committee departments from elsewhere or that were prepared within the Central Committee's own apparatus are accurate, complete, and 100% reliable. And anyone who has worked in the archives of any country, but particularly in former Soviet archives, is well aware of this, that you have to be apprehensive at all times, or certainly cautious when using documents. And I will be stressing that at several points in this talk. Archival sources are often extremely illuminating, but the use of them can be counterproductive if researchers fail to take account of the possibility that certain documents are either deliberately or inadvertently misleading or inaccurate. Ideally, information contained in archival materials should be cross-checked and verified or refuted by comparing it with information in other sources, both closed and open. But unfortunately, in many instances, the process of verification may prove extremely difficult, especially if key materials are missing, as again, I've mentioned that they are in some cases. Memoirs and oral histories, for example, interviews or other things with still living officials, that's becoming harder and harder to do. But memoirs and oral histories can be used for cross-checking archival information, but those sources pose problems of their own, some very well-known problems. The problems can be mitigated if scholars draw on memoirs and oral histories from several participants who have very different viewpoints. This can be done, for example, if you look at memoirs of the failed August 1991 coup in Moscow. There are many memoirs written about that from officials who had very different perspectives on those events. And then you would correlate each account with the archival documents in question. But even that method is by no means foolproof, and there may not always be a sufficient number of memoirs available, especially as you go further back in time, before it became possible to publish useful memoirs. In a few extreme cases, the process of attempting to corroborate archival materials can itself lead to even greater confusion than before. Other problems from working in the Soviet and East European archives can ensue if scholars fail to take account of the context and impact of the documents they examine. For example, you always have to ask who saw what, a particular document, that is, for whom was it written, who was the expected reader, and it has to be judged accordingly. What impact did the documents have, if any, and when? So there too, it can really slow down your analysis or understanding of the particular documents. How were documents processed? That is, where did they go first? Were they circulated to others? And then what happened to them later? And part of that is, why were the documents preserved, particularly if you bear in mind that archival records in the Soviet Union were under the NKVD/KGB, the jurisdiction of the NKVD, KGB for many years, for almost a quarter of a century, until 1958. There is also the question of revelations from a single key document versus crucial patterns that become available only after scrutinizing hundreds or thousands of documents. So sometimes you will come across a single document that may tell you a great deal about what you want to know. But often what you find is that you have to go through vast quantities of documents to notice particular patterns of things. It may not even be what you had in mind initially. It may simply come to you as you go through all of these records, and you suddenly learn something important simply by going through so many records. Diaries, memoirs, and oral testimony. Again, the problems here are that there can be either legitimate, that is perfectly understandable feelings of memory. Also, most people tend to recall events in a way that reflects favorably on them. There are, in other cases, though, deliberately misleading memoirs, or people who are interviewed will give deliberately misleading answers. And all of that has to be borne in mind, too, that there is no way of getting around the very significant problems that any archival researcher is going to confront. One obvious pitfall is the tendency to look for one's keys where the streetlight is. That is, if some materials aren't available, you'll ascribe excessive importance to documents that are available. That, again, is not simply, that's not a problem limited to the former Soviet archives. It exists in many archives around the world. For example, even though the accessible archives contain large quantities of foreign intelligence documents, those items only, in Regani, for example, or Regaspi, you'll find large quantities of these. There are copies of materials that are they're stored in Yasenova at the Foreign Intelligence Archive. But those, the copies that exist at these archives only partly make up for scholars' lack of access to the KGB, SVR, and GRU archives. Only rarely do scholars come across highly sensitive reports that had a crucial bearing on certain decisions. And the same is true of vital inputs generated by the Soviet High Command and General Staff. That even though the Ministry of Defense archive has been partly accessible, it is since the 1990s, there is a great deal there that has not been made available. So you do have to, again, take account of trying to avoid relying solely on what is available. But let me discuss what is an ironic trend. From 2012 through February 2022, that is the decade before Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. In that previous decade, from 2012, when Vladimir Putin came back as Russian president, he had served as prime minister for 4 years to comply with constitutional niceties. But then he announced in September 2011 that he would be coming back as president, ostensibly through an election, but the results were well known in advance. So during that decade, the archival situation in Russia actually improved a great deal, despite Putin's forceful authoritarian clampdown. During that time, throughout that time, the political situation in Russia kept getting worse and worse. But ironically, access and working conditions in the country's federal archives steadily improved. Archival openness often goes hand in hand with democratization, but that was not the case in Russia. Democracy was non-existent under Putin, yet the archival situation improved. It's one of the great ironies of the Putin era for archival researchers like me. It was something that was hard to impossible to explain in many respects. But the trend was definitely there. And again, the political situation was going in the opposite direction. Extremely important collections of Soviet documents became available for the first time in Moscow in 2014, and even larger collections amounting to many millions of pages of sensitive documents were opened in August 2015. I remember coming across these. There was no announcement that they had suddenly been opened, but I came across them when I noticed that the finding aid had gotten much thicker. So it's given researchers, or it gave researchers, a huge number of new research avenues to pursue. Other crucial collections became available in Moscow in December 2018, when Rigani, which had been closed for 2.5 years during its move to a new location across the Moscow River, the Moskva, reopened on its Sofiyskaya Naberezhnaya, reopened with much better working conditions than previously. It's hard to overstate how much better the working conditions were than they were at any time in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the working conditions there were truly awful. But after the move to a new location when it reopened in December 2018, the working conditions were vastly better. The reading room was in many respects nicer. Certainly the lavatories were much nicer. Other voluminous, extremely important collections were made available in 2020 and 2021 after there was a relatively brief pandemic-related closure of the archives, but that lasted only about 3 or 4 months. And when the archives reopened, it was still difficult to get to Russia even after they reopened. But certainly by the late summer of 2021, the new materials were accessible there. So despite the dismal political situation in Russia under Putin prior to February 2022, opportunities to explore Soviet history in the Cold War based on documents from the Russian archives were much better as of mid-February 2022 than at any time in the past. And again, I was I last worked in the Moscow archives. I left on the 9th of February 2022, and certainly at that point, both access and working conditions in the main archives I mentioned were better than any time in the 1990s. It's again one of the great ironies. So let me then, I will end by discussing some of the questions about prospects after the war. To discuss, clearly the war hasn't affected, it certainly hasn't in any way directly affected archival research in the Baltic countries, where again, archives are wide open, have been since the end of the Soviet Union. That includes former KGB archives there too, although they're much less extensive than in Kiev, where the former KGB or Ukrainian KGB archive was. Archival research in Central Asia, which is difficult, except in Kyrgyzstan, but in other countries it's been difficult, but certainly has been available. In the South Caucasus, in Armenia and Georgia, it has been accessible, especially Georgia, but Azerbaijan has been a much tougher situation. The archivists are cordial, but basically mostly they're key people from working there. Moldova has been similarly has been quite open since the 1990s. I first went there, I guess it was in 1996 or 97, and it was already functioning pretty well there. So in all of these cases, archival research has been only indirectly affected, and really you can still go there and work there. And I suspect for many graduate students, that is what they will end up doing, at least for the indefinite future. The situation is much more complicated in Ukraine and above all in Russia. It's complicated in Ukraine because Ukraine, as I mentioned, is coming under attack. On any day there could be a missile strike against Kiev or against another site with Ukrainian archives. So in Ukraine, though, once the war ends, the archives may take some months to restore normal operations, simply to adjust to the new situation. And so it'll be probably a while before researchers could start working again there. But overall, I have no doubt that the degree of access and the quality of working conditions, which were excellent prior to the war, that they are almost certain to be as good as before, that is after the war. I'm sure that the same excellent situation will return eventually in Ukraine. It's a very different matter in Russia. Again, I've been tracking the websites of the individual archives. Often you don't find the current propaganda on those websites, except the head of the archival service, Artizov, has gotten involved in putting out a collection of materials that supposedly corroborate the article that Putin published in July 2021 in his effort to show that Ukrainians were really just Russians. It's a historical distortion and a really tendentious article that was published, and Artizov got dragged in to publish a collection of declassified documents that supposedly bear out that article. The collection has not, again, on the individual websites, that collection was put out by the Federal Archival Service, and the individual archive websites have tried to avoid getting involved in that sort of thing. But whether, again, they given the wartime situation and the draconian crackdown on political activities and the censorship, the rampant censorship that have been implemented, it's hard to say what the status of the archives will be if the war ever ends. So researchers who are thinking, that is graduate students and other researchers who are thinking about conducting archival research in Russia after the war. And, again, I would strongly recommend that no one contemplate trying it during the war, because one of the criteria I've listed here cannot be guaranteed. That is physical safety, not being arrested, not being accused of being a foreign spy or some other ludicrous charge. But given the internal clampdown in Russia during the war, especially after the laws on the 5th of March, 2022 were adopted, there's no one who could guarantee that safety. And that will remain an issue after the war. But there are also moral questions, that is, given the war of, really genocidal, a quasi-genocidal war of aggression that Russia has embarked on, is whether one wants to work in such a country, to do research in such a country. This issue for me is important, but it's certainly not all determining. And I have also worked in the Chinese archives. I did research in the Chinese archives on several occasions, although the unlike in Russia, where the archival situation and political deterioration had an inverse relationship. That is, the political situation kept getting worse and worse, but the archival situation, at least in the federal archives, kept getting better. In China, it's been a very different matter. Xi Jinping basically put an end to the very limited archival openness that existed in China. So after around 2016, 2017, I found that I was no longer being given access to materials there. And so there were moral questions about doing research in China too. It's a communist autocracy, a very repressive country. But those did not, doing archival research in a country is not a statement of approval about that country. So moral questions will be important in Russia after the war, but not necessarily all determining. Physical safety, though, is a very different matter, especially about not ending up being arrested, as say Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter was, or as Brittany Griner, the U.S. basketball player was, or others, simply being accused of being a foreign agent or some other ridiculous grounds for being arrested. So that's a very important consideration that any graduate student should have at the foremost of considerations. The feasibility of travel and entry is another one. During at the very start of the war, essentially a blockade was established. It's not impermeable. You can still go to Russia through Serbia or through Turkey or through several other routes through Central Asia. So it's not impermeable, and you can get there, but it's very difficult overall to get to Russia. Also, you have to have a entry visa, which right now are not really being processed for Western countries. My multiple entry, 3-year multiple entry visa expired in January of this year, and there's no reason to try to get it renewed. The status of archival access and working conditions after the war is a big unknown. And here, again, I care far more about the security of Ukraine and the safety of Ukrainians than I do about the status of archives in Russia. But I do care about the status of archives in Russia. I know quite a few of the archivists. Many of them are highly professional. I hope that they will still be working after the war. I also hope that the archives will again become accessible and a suitable place in which to do research. But currently, what will happen with those archives and what will happen with the working conditions is a big unknown. So for 30 years, graduate students and other researchers, that is from the early 1990s until February 2022, graduate students and other researchers had the opportunity to pursue archival research in Russia, but that will not be the case for the indefinite future. I hate to be too blunt about this. It does seem like a grim prognosis, but unfortunately, it's simply an acknowledgement of reality, that there really aren't opportunities. The scholars of my generation had those opportunities. Scholars of today's graduate students don't have that opportunity, unfortunately. I wish I could offer a somewhat more optimistic outlook here, but it really isn't something to be optimistic about. So what are their workarounds? There are things that graduate students should bear in mind. There are large volumes, large collections of declassified Soviet documents available in North America and in Western Europe. But I mentioned North America because these are the collections I know best. At Harvard, we do the Cold War Studies Archive has somewhere around 15 to 20 million pages of declassified documents in photocopies and microfilms, some microfiche as well. There are some that have been digitized, but because these documents were gathered before digitization was widespread, that the digitization is still fairly limited. The Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. has its invaluable Cold War International History Project, which is part of the larger public policy and history program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Those are headed by Christian Osterman, and it's been an extraordinarily valuable organization to facilitate archival research, not only in the former Soviet Union, but in many other former communist countries, and has published many, or at least made available many documents in translation as well as the originals. The National Security Archive, which is a non-governmental repository. It is similar name to the National Security Agency, the intelligence agency in Fort Meade that handles electronic intelligence and intercepts and communications. But the National Security Archive is a non-governmental organization based at George Washington University. And even though its main focus is on US documents, the collection, declassification, and collection of US documents, of which it has so many that I would hesitate even to venture a guess at the amount. But over the last particularly 25 years or so, the National Security Archive has also increasingly emphasized former Soviet documents, and so it has also made available many of these. Svetlana Savranskaya, who is currently in charge of that effort, has played a huge role in making these available, and has published collections of materials along with the director of the National Security Archive, Tom Blanton, very important volumes of US-Soviet summits and meetings that occurred during the Gorbachev period. The Stanford University has its Hoover Institution archives, which have very large collections of Soviet documents, microfilmed, primarily some photocopies. It has one collection in particular that is not available elsewhere, which is the Katayev collection, the papers of Vitaly Katayev at the Hoover Archive. So again, there are a lot of collections that students can look at. There are also many important published volumes of documents. The Sborniki, as they're known in Russian, the published volumes, probably by now there are several hundred of these. Some put out by the Yakovlev Foundation, some put out by Memorial, some put out by the archival institutions themselves in the Federal Archival Service. So there are many of these that are extremely useful. And all of these records should be looked at, even if at some point the archival situation is, the access to archives is available again in Russia and Ukraine. So in the past, another thing that people ask me about quite often is whether it's possible to enlist Russian graduate students to employ them to do research. In the past, certainly in the 1990s, many Russian graduate students were eager to do this for Western scholars because it provided a lucrative alternative to any job they might do in Russia. And in fact, there were private companies, some Russian, some foreign, that were established in the 1990s to put foreign scholars in touch with Russian graduate students who could do archival research for them. I certainly never used that option myself, but I do know of people who did it at that point. However, that earlier practice has become vastly more complicated since February 2022. Russian graduate students at places like Moscow State University and Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, and Russian State Humanities University, RGGU, see people around them being arrested for expressing any doubt about the war and for supposedly having ties with foreign entities. So even if the graduate students are bound to be leery of doing even the most uncontroversial archival work for Western researchers, lest it be held against them. But even if they were willing to do the work, there would be great difficulty paying them. It is simply right now impossible to carry out a wire transfer to a bank account in Russia. There perhaps are some who have bank accounts in New York or in somewhere in Europe, but that would be only a very small number, and still there are other reasons they might not want to do it. So until February 2022, all the federal archives in Moscow, including the ones I've mentioned, Rigani, Rigaspi, Garf, and others offered to do paid research in-house. So they too could be enlisted to do research for foreign scholars. Information about this type of research assistance is still present on the archive's websites, but whether they would still be willing to do the work for Western scholars is uncertain. I don't know of anyone who has attempted it, but to try to have them do research now. But still, it's not clear how they would be paid, because they do, before they actually hand over copies of the records, either electronic or paper, they would need to be paid, and it's not clear how that could be done. So where I will end then is simply to say that my prognosis for the archival situation in Russia for the indefinite future is quite gloomy. And I, again, don't want to present a falsely optimistic situation, because it isn't one that should be regarded as optimistic. It is, unfortunately, among the many terrible things that have happened as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. The archival situation is another. It's not the most important, but for those who have valued as I have valued the opportunity to do archival research over the last 30 years prior to February 2022, it is all the more reason to really loathe this war and to hope that somehow it will end soon with the Ukrainian victory. But still, even that, as I've indicated, is no guarantee that there will still, it'll ever return to what it had been for many years. And so that is where I will end. Let me stop share now, and I will be glad to take questions if people have them. It looks like there are quite a few questions. So not sure I understand the earlier more available. Yeah, I mean, so the first question has to do with what materials are available. I refer to only a small fraction of these. The archives in Russia, even though there were some periods in which archival materials were destroyed or removed, overall the archives are extremely rich, well stocked, because of the high degree of organization of the archives. It would be difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to falsify materials or to forge documents. It's not, again, not impossible, so you always have to be on guard about that. But it is conceivable that there could be an attempt made to do that. But because the archive, the Soviet Union ended abruptly, and the archival heads themselves, the employees, did not anticipate that the Soviet Union would break up. There really wasn't a systematic effort to do that. It would be on an isolated case-by-case basis. And as I say, the way files are constructed, bound in wax-sealed folders, it would be quite difficult to falsify things. There are, as I indicated, there are also, in some instances, materials that at one time were not available, but that end up being published later on. So you can try to cross-check various things. The diaries and memoirs that have become available, which again vary a great deal in how useful they are, but still the ones that were published after the breakup of the Soviet Union tend to be the ones that are most useful to look at. Memoirs that were published before 1985 are not especially valuable. There are some that are, The memoirs of some of the Soviet military commanders during the Second World War are actually pretty useful overall, even though they had to comply with Soviet strictures. But they do provide some useful information about the war. But many memoirs that were published, including some that were published after the breakup of the Soviet Union, are not especially useful. That would include, for example, Lazar Kaganovich, who was a highly influential official during the Stalin era and then was ousted under Khrushchev. He lived to old age, almost 100 years old, and he published his memoirs. I think they came out in 1996. They were of very little use. There are a few passages in them that are occasionally insightful, but most of it is the kind of turgid Stalinist prose you would expect of Kaganovich. With regard to Memorial, a questioner mentioned 68% digitized. As I understand it, at least my information may be incorrect, but I thought actually by now it was essentially all the materials, maybe not all of the regional branches of Memorial. The status of those regional branches is ambiguous at the moment because the disbandment of Memorial, the banning of Memorial, proceeded against the central organization, and that's where the bulk of the archival files were. But the regional branches have important collections of their own. I'm not sure the extent to which those were digitized as well. I know there was an effort underway. I played a very small role in some of that, but the digitization of the central archives, I thought, had been completed, although I may be wrong about that. So the Memorial, which is a non-governmental organization set up in 1987 toward the end of the Soviet era, during as soon as the political opportunity structure began to change under Gorbachev, there were courageous individuals, including Andrei Sakharov, but also scholars who, Arseny Roginsky, for example, who died a couple of years ago, or a few years ago, and they set up Memorial as a way of trying to capture what the archival records and oral testimonies and photographs and other collections from the Stalin period in particular. Over time, the functions of Memorial expanded, but basically it focused on documenting the repressions of the Stalin era, especially the victims of the Great Terror and of the victims of earlier reigns of repression earlier periods of repression under Stalin, the dekulakization, the collectivization, and the Great Purges, and then culminating in the Great Terror when there were over 800,000 people shot in the space of 16 months in 1937 and 1938. That was all during peacetime. To shoot more than 800,000 of your own citizens requires such an enormous exertion of ruthless state power that is still hard to fathom nowadays. It's the only comparable instance in recent history would be the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But the Khmer Rouge, admittedly, were dealing with a much smaller population, so they killed a much higher percentage of the population, but still, many of those died through starvation. The systematic murder of more than 800,000 Soviet citizens in 1937, 1938 occurred through shooting predominantly. And it's still a staggering crime that Memorial sought to document as extensively as possible, but is still, in many foreign researchers have been involved, as well as the Russian researchers, Russian and Ukrainian researchers, and others from the former Soviet Union who have been involved. So what is the archival research in the North Caucasus republics. I did do work in Chechnya. Unfortunately, the archives in Chechnya were heavily damaged during the first war between the war from December 1994 until August 1996. The archives in Grozny were heavily damaged during that period, and the archive was never, at least when I was last there, which was, I guess, in 2007, November 2007, had not really been restored to a useful status. It's possible it has been now, but given the awful situation in Chechnya under Ramzan Kadyrov, a tyrant, a repressive tyrant, truly out of a almost a comic book of what a brutal tyrant would be like. So the he clearly does not value archival research, and I doubt the situation there has in any way improved, unlike the situation in the Moscow archives. In other areas of the North Caucasus, Dagestan, and Kabardino-Balkaria and elsewhere, I did not do research there, so I cannot attest to the state of the archives, but certainly the various regional and local archives varied a great deal in their accessibility, especially archives that contain KGB records. So it, again, after the war, it's possible that there will once again be access to those regional and local archives, but it's really at this point entirely dependent on what happens with the war. What is the status of archival? Whoops, that was what I just answered. Also, just to say a few words about I'm going through the questions now, is that the archival research in other republics. And again, I touched on this very briefly in my presentation, but certainly in the Baltic states, the archival situation has been excellent from the 1990s on, and no problems working there for anyone. Anyone can go there, work in the archives. If you want to work on the 1930s, though, or early 40s, the Baltic states were not part of the Soviet Union until after the Second World War. I mean, they began to be annexed in 1940, but you won't find anything there about the Great Terror, though, or anything. So if your research is on the post 1945 period, then there is a great deal there, even though it's primarily focused on the Baltic states. You will on occasion find copies of other documents, and there is a very useful online repository of some of these documents that are from the former KGB archives in the Baltic states. And these include some of the central Soviet KGB records, including records from the higher school of the KGB, the training school of the KGB. So the archival research there is certainly worthwhile. In the case of the South Caucasus, I mentioned already Armenia and Georgia, especially Georgia, archival research has been feasible, including in some of the former KGB materials, but it is spotty and at times has been erratic, depending on the wider political situation in Georgia. But overall, it is certainly, that is a route for graduate students to think about. Central Asia, as I indicated, has been a tougher situation, that the closer you get to the present, for example, when I was in Kazakhstan, I was seeking materials on the December 1986 unrest in Alma-Ata, as the capital was unknown. It was difficult to get materials, so I eventually got them not directly from the archives, but through a non-governmental organization there that had started to collect documents from that period. And they proved extremely useful about the unrest in December 1986. This was the situation when the then longtime party secretary, first secretary in Kazakhstan, Dinmuhammad Kunayev, was abruptly replaced with a Russian, Gennady Kolbin, and it stirred opposition to that move, stirred protests primarily among students, but then more broadly in December 1986. And I fairly recently published an article about those events, and it was based in part on the archival materials I was able to obtain there. And similarly in Kyrgyzstan, I had no problem working in the archives. The problem in Kyrgyzstan was I didn't really find much that was of interest to me. Uzbekistan, I had a much greater problem. There are researchers who have worked in Uzbekistan and have made out pretty well. I am not among them. I mostly got a runaround in the Uzbek archives and kept on having new obstacles placed in front of me and eventually ran out of time. So I didn't have a particularly positive view of the Uzbek archives, but after the death of Islam Karimov, some researchers did report that they have had better access. In the case of the Tajik and Turkmen archives, as I mentioned, I have not attempted to work there, and the Tajik archives I know are mostly, were heavily damaged during the war in the early to mid 1990s, and it's therefore hard for me to think that that researchers are going to be able to do much research there. Although Artemy Kalinovsky recently published a very, very good book that deals with Tajikistan, even though he's looking at it from a somewhat different perspective. So there are opportunities. Even Turkmenistan, I have no idea. So those are some of the comments that I would have about that. Suffice to say, you can do this kind of archival research now. I know researchers who are going to these archives. If they hadn't already, they certainly will be or should be. You mentioned about the being cautious in using electronic data, etc. Is it because of the archival So the questioner is asking about the cautions I offered, the various caveats I offered about archival research. This is not, in some of these caveats are not unique to dealing with the former Soviet archives. They are also caveats about almost any country, including working in US archives, the National Archives, and College Park, Maryland, or the various presidential libraries that are part of the National or come under the jurisdiction of the National Archives and Records Administration in the United States. You have to be cautious there too. In fact, in some ways, even more cautious, because officials in the United States have been aware for many years that the documents that they produce will eventually become open for researchers and public scrutiny. And so there is, in many ways, an even greater temptation to produce things that will make that particular official look important or better than was actually the case. It's not again, it's not a common thing, but you will find it, and you have to always be cautious about it. When dealing with the former Soviet archives, there are, as I've already mentioned, quite a few of these cautions that the archives were under the control of or the supervision of the NKVD, KGB for many years during the Stalin period and into the early Khrushchev years. It wasn't until 1958 that a separate archival service was established, and the records were separated. And in fact, at that point in 1958, what is roughly the structure that existed through the rest of the Soviet period exists, and it's still the structure that is basically there now, where you have the federal archives, and in Russia, and the separate Ведомственные archives, the departmental archives, the ones that were given the right to maintain their own archives, like the Federal Archive, the Federal Security Service, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Intelligence Service. So with regard to statistical records, a questioner asks about statistical records depends on what they are counting. You know, when it comes to victims of the terror or other repressions during the Stalin period, you have to be very cautious about these. It's become that the initial figure for the Great Terror was around 683,000. As researchers in France, Germany, and Russia began doing research, more extensive research on this question, they clearly realized that many deaths from the Great Terror were excluded from that 683,000. That's why now it is a figure of more than 800,000 shot during those 16 peacetime months. It's really an extraordinary thing, and any statistical records you come across in the archives about such matters have to be very circumspectly weighed and evaluated. And you know, that has been done and is still being done now. With regard to other things like party membership or some of the draft era records from the Gorbachev period to look at whether evasion of the draft was increasing, many of those are pretty accurate. That is, there was no inherent reason to keep inaccurate data about party membership, for example. And so you will come across voluminous records about party censuses or about the membership tolls, the membership records of the various branches of the Soviet Communist Party, the ones in the Union republics that are now part of the independent countries of the former Soviet Union. With regard to other caveats I offered about, can you talk about, so with regard to accessibility and how you try to judge documents, this, as I mentioned, that it's important not to look for your keys just where the street light is. You should also be aware that maybe that street light isn't there for materials you need, and never will be there. The documents might not exist. For example, any orders given orally only are not going to exist. There are other materials, especially in the intelligence archives, that as the head of the Foreign Intelligence Archive was asked, I guess about 12, 13 years ago, when his archive would be open. And his response was one word, nikogda, that is never. So, you know, I mean, short of some dramatic political transformation in Russia, I'm not expecting the central intelligence archives of the Soviet regime to be accessible. There are, as I mentioned, in some of the other Union Republic archives, there are copies of some, but only a very small portion of foreign intelligence records, mainly because they weren't really involved in foreign intelligence, except intelligence about goings on along their borders. And in that case, they do keep records, but that was primarily a counterintelligence task. That was not predominantly foreign intelligence. And foreign intelligence and military intelligence was really centrally controlled. A question that would be interesting is it known if there were significant changes in again, I can judge. I mean, I've tried to find out from people who are still in Moscow and still even doing research in the archives. Overall, I would say through this summer, I can't attest after, because the most recent assessment I received was from, I believe it was mid-July. And as of this summer, the archives are still operating fairly normally in Moscow, I'm talking about, still operating fairly normally. Far fewer researchers there, but still have the same materials available. So overall, I would say, yes, it is true that the archival procedures have continued to exist during the war. The archives have, which, as I mentioned, had achieved quite a high degree of professionalism during that decade before the war, that I suspect that the archival employees will hope to maintain that, even though they are undoubtedly coming under pressure and have to be very cautious about what they do or say. But certainly the websites, they're accessible. And as I mentioned, Rigani's website, for some reason, which was readily available until I guess it was sometime in late August. I happened to be on the website when it went down in late August. I was looking at a recent exhibit they had of the processing of so the rewriting of Soviet history during the Stalin era to make it look much more positive about Stalin. And they had a very interesting exhibit about that. And I was looking at that exhibit and suddenly it went down, and I thought it was a temporary glitch. But I have checked almost every day since then, and it still is not accessible, unlike all the other federal archives, which are readily accessible. I should note that, again, one important way in which the archival conditions improved during that decade from 2012 to 2022 was that electronic finding aids were put online on almost all of the archives websites. So you could actually, at least until very recently on Rigani's website, look at individual files that you might want to look at in order. You could even order them, but you can't order copies to be scanned, but you could certainly determine what you wanted to look at. Those archival finding aids, OPC as they're known, are still available for all the other archives. And there is also a central database made available on Rosarchiv's, the Russian archival services website, and that is still accessible. So you can look there to try to get a sense of what's there. I haven't noticed in any way a curtailment of access, judging from those facilities. But again, what the situation will be after the war will depend in part on how the war ends, and also how the current authorities in Russia under Putin, Putin's heavy hand, will try to engage in reprisals from what is a disastrous blunder on Russia's part. So how Soviet Union documents in Harvard's collection. So at Harvard, there is now, we've established a website that goes through the various records we have. Some of these are copies of a huge microfilm project that the Hoover Institution archive at Stanford did. This includes all of the Gulag records, the records of the main archival administration, the main administration of the Gulag, the series, the network of repressive institutions and camps that the NKVD, the various state security organs during the Lenin and Stalin years maintained. And that comes to the more or less full collection were microfilm. That's around, I believe, 10 to 11 million pages were microfilmed, and it's several thousand reels of microfilm. I think somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 were microfilm. It didn't, because of there were glitches in the processing of those materials. And I should add that the whole episode is recounted in fascinating detail in a forthcoming memoir by Charles Palm from the Hoover Institution Press. Palm was the head of the Hoover Institution archives during that period and played a crucial role in putting together that microfilming project that eventually generated microfilms of the finding aids, which now you can actually get online, the finding aids, but at that point you couldn't get them online. And similarly, copies of many files, even though a very small percentage, still they're valuable to have. So we have a full set of those at Harvard, and we also have full set of Fund 89 documents, a much smaller collection, smaller but very important collection on microfilm. We have digitized records of some of the former Soviet records, and certainly many others from the former Soviet bloc. I would estimate it somewhere, I think I mentioned 15 to 20 million pages beyond what is on the microfilm. So it's a very large collection. These also include records from East European countries, the various East European countries I've worked in, but the ones I'm referring to here are from the former Soviet Union, and primarily from Russia and Ukraine. Some fairly large collection from the Baltic states, much smaller collections from Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. So let's see, a question would be, I know I'm beginning to come to the end of the seminar, so let me see if I can group together some questions. You see significant change of archival since February. So their archival employees, as best I can tell, have not been, there hasn't really been a market change. I would become alarmed if I began seeing political flunkies brought into the archives. But so far that doesn't seem to have been done, at least at the archives that I know well. I had a lot of respect for the archival employees prior to February 2022. That is, I'm not commenting on their integrity now, but still, they behaved professionally. Contrary to, I know there were a lot of stories in the 1990s about bribes and the like. I never was asked for a bribe. I certainly would not have paid one, and never had that problem, never had that trade-off to make. I would simply not do it under any circumstances because there is the moral hazard. Once you've done it, you will be expected to do it in the future. So if that were to ever arise, I certainly would not have done it, but I never encountered it. I generally encountered archival employees who were professional. They weren't, many were amiable as well, but some were not. But as long as they were professional, that was fine with me. Have you heard of instances that archivists have been punished for working with foreign scholars? So this is a concern that what I would, the question deals with whether archivists or students have been punished for doing research for foreign scholars. It definitely is a concern that you should have. It's not only about whether students would be willing to do it, it's about whether, if in the process of enlisting them, you would be placing them in danger as well. So it definitely is a concern. I do know of, again, I know, there are former colleagues of mine, or at least archival researchers I know very well in Moscow, who are still willing to recommend graduate students. I put someone I know in touch with one of these scholars, and he did line up a graduate student who did the research. This was last year. There were some problems in payment, but overall that did work. It was a small project, and it was fairly simple to carry out. And so far as I know, the student has suffered no adverse consequences from it, but it certainly is a consideration to bear in mind. It's by no means a real workaround for the lack of archival access. I wish I could offer a truly a workaround that would be truly equivalent to the kind of access that I had to the archives for 30 years, but unfortunately there isn't one. There are a lot of good ways to try to plug the gap, but it's nothing that is foolproof or fully equivalent. So my question, whether you think it is possible to research decision-making of Soviet regimes through documents from archives. Okay, this is an important question because I have worked a great deal in the archives of East European countries, especially the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, in Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, former East Germany, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. I've worked in archives in all of these countries. The question pertains to whether you can understand Soviet decision-making on the basis of what you will find in these archives. And the short answer is no. There's it's not going to tell you about a lot of things, but on some issues it will actually tell you a great deal. So for example, in the Bulgarian states, the former state security Državna Sigurnost archive, Komdos, where I had did archival research without any problem this summer. The archival records do contain some important materials pertaining to the Soviet KGB. They don't necessarily shed light on why the KGB did certain things the way it did, but they do tell you a great deal about what the KGB was doing in conjunction with the Bulgarian State Security Service, which was very closely tied to the KGB. They also contain records that the Central Soviet authorities were sending to the East European party leaders, and in the case of some archives, and also the state security, the Central KGB archive was the Central KGB agency itself was sending to its partner organizations in the Warsaw Pact. So yes, you can find important records here that are not accessible in Moscow, or were not accessible as of February 2022 in Moscow. The organization that oversees the former state security records in the Czech Republic has posted a great number of these online. That's the Archiv Bezpečných Složek, the security service archives that has been really putting a great number of collections online. Similarly, the agency that oversees the state security records in Bulgaria, Komdos as it's known, it's a very long name that I won't give here, but Komdos is the way it's usually referred to. And that archive has made available vast quantities of documents online. There are now about 50 separate thematic collections they have, and a couple of these are about the Soviet KGB, about the Soviet NKVD and KGB. And so you can find some of these records even online in digitized forms. And I still encourage people to, the Bulgarian archives are primarily in Bulgarian, and I realize it's only a small number of people who know Bulgarian, but it certainly helps to know Bulgarian using that archive. But the archive has been extremely helpful, and the same is true in the other East European archives. That there's a great deal that graduate students can still do on the basis of the East European archives, even if they will not. The question was about Soviet decision making, and they are certainly not a substitute, but they will help at least a little bit in understanding Soviet decision making. And more importantly, they will help a great deal in understanding the role of the East European states in the Warsaw Pact, and also the internal structures of the communist parties and the government agencies in the various East European states. So with that, unfortunately, I think I've run out of time. Let me see if I could quickly squeeze in the passport. We're planning to go to Russia during the question here. I'll deal with this very briefly because I'm out of time. But this person asks about if researchers are planning to try to work in the Russian archives during the war. I would not recommend it. So I really can't give good advice about this. I would strongly recommend against it for all the reasons I mentioned. There's no guarantee of physical safety. There is no guarantee that a Western researcher would be well received at the archives. It's not because of the archivists, it's more because of the broader political climate. There's also great difficulty in getting to Russia. I mentioned it's not impossible. I do know of an Italian researcher who went there in, I believe it was June, and didn't have a problem. But I would not recommend it. And unfortunately, for the indefinite future, I would caution any graduate student who is thinking of going not to pursue it. The situation in Ukraine is purely one of the constant attacks from Russia, the military attacks. The situation in Russia itself is much more complicated. It's not as dire because, except for occasional attacks that Ukraine is able to carry out with drones, Moscow has been off limits during the war, but still it's not that so much that is the major risk as the other things I mentioned. So let me end then today's seminar simply by saying that I wish I had a brighter outlook on the scope for archival research for the indefinite future. I don't, though, and I don't want to present a falsely optimistic picture. There are some important workarounds. Certainly, graduate students and other researchers should go to the other former Soviet republics, should go to Eastern European archives, should look to the collections of documents that are stored in or have been published, or the ones that are stored in various formats in the repositories I mentioned, and those were the main ones. There are others as well, but still, it's not going to be equivalent to returning to the situation that existed as of February 2022. And for the indefinite future, I guess I will be quite pessimistic about the prospects for archival research in the former USSR, except in those 13, let me leave aside Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, except in the other 11 republics, that there really isn't a bright outlook. So that's where I will end, and let me thank everyone for joining today's seminar. Thank you.